today we are talking about Google Analytics 4. So the big news is that on July 1st, 2023, Universal Analytics, which we know and love, or the classic analytics we know, is going away and will be replaced by Google Analytics 4. So today, the goal is to answer all your questions on migration to Google Analytics 4, timelines, what's new in GA4 that we can take advantage of, what's different between GA4 and Universal Analytics, all that good stuff. And to educate us on that today, we have with us a brilliant mind in the world of tracking. He is a digital tracking wizard extraordinaire. He is also the longest tenured WebMechanix employee. He is our director of development and marketing and tracking development wizard, Derek Cavaliero, joining us today to guide us through this transition. So Derek, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, no problem. Happy to be here.
Yeah. So let's dive right in. I guess start us off at a high level. What is Google Analytics 4 and why should us marketers care? And why is this important now?
Sure. So I guess this Google Analytics 4, it's kind of like named like much different than all the other versions of analytics. And I don't know how long people have been inside the industry, but analytics has actually gone through several different versions as it's gone along. So they started out when they bought Urchin Tracker way back in 2005. So Google actually didn't build the analytics tool themselves to begin with. They inherited it from another company that they purchased it from. And then they started building onto that platform that was built back in 2005. So what we're really looking at is a transition from any really old software that's gone over slight iterations over the past few years, like 2005 for Urchin, 2007 for classic GA. And then Universal Analytics came about around 2012. And then 8 whole years until now, or 2020 when GA4 was kind of put into beta, if you will. Now we're at that GA4. So that's why it's called GA4. There's actually been 3 other iterations if you count the other names of them, but they've never been called like GA1, 2, and 3. So like that's like what it is. So like that's the high level. The why should you care now? Well, Universal Analytics is going to be shut down at the beginning of January 2024. They are going to stop collecting new data next July 1st in 2023. So if you do use Universal Analytics for a lot of your reporting, like general analysis type purposes, now's the time to act so that you can get some data in there before that shutdown and that data collection stops happening next July. So that's it from a very broad perspective, but I can stop and see if anybody has general questions in that regard.
Yeah, guys, if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. Derek, I am curious. So what can we expect? So I imagine a lot of us are used to the interface and the tools within Universal Analytics. What's new in GA4? What are some of the differences that we can expect going into?
Yes. So the biggest thing to note is that GA4 is a big shift. It's not a small iteration off of something like Urchin to Classic or Classic to Universal, where there was just minor things that changed with adding new features to the existing structure of the product. GA4 in and of itself is a completely separate software with a completely different data model, which means that it's going to take a little bit more effort to migrate to as compared to doing something like upgrading yourself from Classic to Universal, for instance. But with that, like that new model comes a lot of change, but it's change that's long overdue. Like I mentioned, like we are talking about a software in Urchin Tracker that was bought in 2005. And most of the changes between 2005 and 2020 were all based off of a data model that was based at like the very infancy of like the internet as we know it today. And things have changed drastically over that time. Think of how mobile exploded in that time frame. Applications, all that kind of stuff didn't exist back in 2005. So Google finally bit the bullet and rebuilt the data model as based off of what is known now and not kind of sticking with that old platform. So with that, the idea, one of the major things that's different is there's no more hit types inside GA or Universal Analytics or GA4, so to speak. What you would be used to in the past is you'd like go in and say, I want to see page views for XYZ, or I want to see events for XYZ. Everything inside GA4 is an event with like an event name and then parameters that describe that event to some degree. Which is very similar to a lot of modern analytics tools and ad tracking tools out there. Facebook being probably the most common one that most people on this call will probably be familiar with. They do the same thing. So they have like explicitly named events that you can use. and you send parameters through to describe that data in rich detail. So it's more flexible in nature because you have like kind of like it's kind of more of like a blank canvas where you can say, okay, I want to name my event this and send through explicitly named parameters rather than being forced into that data model where some things are tracked as page views as an explicit hit type, and then events have their own dimensions of like category, action, label, and all this stuff. Trying to jam a bunch of information into those three primary dimensions was really difficult to manage and understand over time whenever a lot of people got their hands into the cookie jar, because this happens over years and years and years of maintaining it. GA4 is a more flexible model, but with that flexibility comes some more work that you have to do to set it up, both from the implementation side of things and from the reporting setup too. Because one of the best things about universal analytics was a lot of the reports that you love and use on a day-to-day fashion are kind of pre-built for you, and you can hop in there and get into things like your traffic analysis and like your landing page visits and stuff like that. By default, GA4 out of the box is a very like clean slate, like kind of like big white piece of paper that you're able to do pretty much whatever you want to do with, but it's up to the end user's discretion to set it up in the fashion that is required for their business. So there's more setup work there, which makes it have a little bit more of a higher learning curve, or a steeper learning curve, if you will, compared to universal analytics. So that is like one of the biggest things. It's a more flexible tool, but because of that, it's kind of more of like a business analysis or business intelligence type tool, rather than something that's just been based off of like analyzing web type data since 2005. So it's got that like kind of that shift, that mind shift in a way. So I'll stop there. There's some more items there, but I just don't want to ramble too far.
Yeah. Well, one of the big and interesting and unique differences, I think, when we went from Urchin to Classic and Classic to Universal, is basically like, hey, there are these new features involved, and just update your code a little bit and you'll be on board. But this is more of like a, hey, this thing is going away, and if you still want to use it, you have to take fairly massive action.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think a lot of the fear is that a lot of people are hopping into GA4 and expecting it to operate like universal analytics, because that's what we're just all accustomed to. Because it's different, there will be a little bit of unease with it at first. But over time, just like with anything, the more you go in and use it, the more things get natural. There are some stuff that's still rough around the edges, so to speak. And we'll talk about like some of the stuff to watch out for, just some of the limitations so far in a little bit here. But there's like just a general mindset like shift for GA4, especially compared to universal analytics, where they're trying to like focus more about user level data instead of session level data, because they're trying to like shift that mindset that you're not really measuring sessions. You're trying to measure like how many people are coming back as users, what users are doing. So there's a lot more things inside your like whatever default reports do exist inside GA4 where there's user centric, whereas when you're hopping into universal analytics, mostly everything is based off of session related data, because that's how that data model's been kind of built out for years and years, right? So the other two things that are really the biggest things that I want to kind of mention is that GA4 doesn't have a permanent data retention policy like UA does or did. So GA4 is going to kind of cap your ability to do like year over year reporting at 14 months with their advanced analysis tools in the actual UI. So that's a giant change from UA. And a lot of that is being driven by the privacy challenges that Google is inheriting. And this is just my thought process behind it, but you can see the writing on the wall, or within the tea leaves, so to speak, that a lot of the data privacy controls that they're introducing in GA4 are it's not a coincidence that it's also coming after these big lawsuits from like the EU and GDPR related stuff, right? You can see that they're shifting the mindset of that. And that's why I think they're doing a fast track, like hard date for UA is going away. You have to use this new thing because they don't want to have the culpability of having that data in their platform for a permanent time. So they will be eventually making your data inside Universal Analytics inaccessible entirely in January 2024. There are some means of getting that data out of Universal Analytics and like put into another system. But there's nothing that Google's going to have like as a quick, like, down and dirty download button, so to speak, from what I've been able to tell. They aren't very transparent with their roadmap, which is kind of a very Google thing to do. But yeah, that's kind of just some stuff to like notice about like the main big differences. And there's a lot of other small little nitpicky things, but if we went into all the detail today, we'd probably be on here for 3 to 4 hours if we wanted to.
So real quick, I got a question for you. I think a lot of the people on this call probably are in a camp of like, yeah, we use Google Analytics. We want to continue using Google Analytics. I've heard of GA4. Everyone says it's different, it's daunting, it's maybe a little bit intimidating. I haven't yet done anything, so I'm behind the curve a little bit. What's something simple that I could do like right after getting off of this call so that I would at least be, maybe not an expert, maybe not using it like a power user right now, but what's a step that I can take in the right direction?
Yeah, so the best thing you can do is just get a simple GA4 config tag set up for a data stream that's collecting page view based data, because there is very little that can go wrong with setting that up. It's a default event. It's automatically captured by the G tag, or if you're using Tag Manager, there's a tag template in there, and set that up. That will at least start getting you page view type data so that you can at least start going in and playing around with the new interface in certain cases. What I would say though is, because of the new event model where it's like an event name that is most of these event names are going to be custom event names that you use for describing what your users or your visitors are doing on the site. So a CTA click, or a video being watched, or video progress happening, that kind of thing. Those types of things, implementing those in a correct fashion in a way that is also scalable to kind of share that data into other platforms. Because the nice thing about GA4 is that it is in that new data model that adheres very closely to something like Facebook, Mixpanel, something like a CDP platform like Segment. They all use this system of an event name with parameters that describe it, for either event parameters or user parameters. So the nice thing is that the industry is standardizing a bit in terms of like the APIs for implementing this stuff, which makes it easier to share that data, or not share, but like reuse that data whenever you're building something out inside, say, Google Tag Manager, simplifying your tagging architecture so that you're not pushing, or you don't have hundreds of tags doing explicit things for Facebook and explicit, like completely different stuff for Universal Analytics and then Bing and all that stuff. It is getting to a point where things are starting to get standardized, which means that like now is the time to kind of relook at your tagging strategy from like a whole, like a broader perspective. But the best thing you can do right now is just get a tag on there that's collecting your page view data, and just start playing around with it. Google does have, go ahead.
How do I do that? Like, what do I physically do? I go to my current Google Analytics, like where do I grab the code snippet? Where do I install it on my site?
So there is, if you go to your existing Google Analytics account or your property that you have set up, or I guess it would be in your account, you would set up a new property. And whenever you set up a new property, by default now, it's going to tell you to set up a GA4 property. If you go through that process, it'll ask you like if you're setting up your property for a web, for like a data stream for the web, for iOS or Android. I probably think most people on this call are talking about it in a web context. There are maybe some people that have Android apps or iOS apps, whatever. That's a little bit more complicated. I'm not going to talk too much about that. You would go in there and you just go through setting up that web stream, and what they're called is like a data stream. You'll set up a data stream, you'll plug in your main website URL, and you'll give the data stream a name. And then when you save that, it'll give you a measurement ID, which is similar to that ID you've been using for your Google Analytics implementation for years, that starts with UA dash some numbers and then dash 1, 2, 3, whatever you have. It will be like an ID with starting with G and then a bunch of characters on it. You will take that ID and then you can use it to implement the Google Analytics 4 config tag inside of your Google Tag Manager account. If you're not familiar with doing that setup part inside Tag Manager, you can send it to the person inside your organization that handles that tagging for you. It takes all of 5 seconds to get in there. Honestly, it's just kind of plug in something and set it up on an all pages trigger for the most part, and you should be good to go for at least collecting like your most basic data. Now, there's other things that go into that down the road when you start talking about the actual like nitty gritty implementation, but that'll at least get you some data flowing into there so you can take a look in the short term.
Cool. So step one, if you get nothing else from this call, you can at least catch up and be, maybe not ahead of the curve, but at least not behind the curve by simply installing the base code, allowing some page views to be pulled. But now, will it track anything other than page views, or is just like basically just like a.
It can. So there's this new feature inside the GA4 properties that you set up, and it's called enhanced measurement, and it's on by default. And what enhanced measurement does is it will track very common things that people will want to track on websites. Some of them are tracked in an odd way that I don't recommend doing if you're doing a full-fledged, like really detailed implementation, but it will track things like YouTube video interaction for like start, progress, and complete of your videos. It will track file download links. So if somebody clicks on like a PDF link, it'll track when people do site search type stuff. So if someone types into a search form and then the query keyword, it'll track like how many people end up on the search results page, like some of that stuff, right? So there is some extra stuff there. That's fine to leave on once you're getting up and running and getting started, because you just want to get data flowing into there. Whenever you're doing something in a more detailed fashion, I may suggest to turn some of that stuff off and actually migrate those rules for how that data is collected inside something like Tag Manager, because very often you're going to be wanting to track stuff like video interaction and file downloads and stuff like that into something like Facebook. So it makes it sense for that stuff to kind of live inside Tag Manager instead of just inside the GA4 ecosystem by itself, if that makes sense. So like there is that capability.
Yeah, so Derek, Tim O'Keefe has a question. So he says, we just launched a website redesign and use GTM in a big way to track specific items. Will existing GTM tags work with GA4, and what extra effort might that require?
It really depends on what your tags are that you're speaking about. If they're explicitly universal analytics tags inside your Tag Manager account, most likely you're going to have to dual tag to get the GA4 stuff running. There is some features inside of analytics that you can turn, or inside a GA4 property that you can turn on to say, take all of my universal analytics events and then mirror them to GA4. I would highly advise to not take that method, because you do not want to take the old data model from universal analytics and force it into GA4. It may work for a very short-term solution, but over time, you're going to want to have those explicitly named events with the detailed parameters, rather than trying to do these big confusing reports based off of those three primary dimensions that you have inside universal analytics for like category action label. That would be like probably one of the biggest like implementation, like stay away from type things. Don't do it's tempting to do the quick fix and get the data in there to some degree, but you also need that data to be usable. And it may take a little bit more time to set up, but you'll thank yourself later whenever you have the ability to go in and analyze a particular like parameter that's being attached to an event, rather than having to parse out a like an event action or event label that has like three different pieces of data like truncate or glued together inside there, so to speak, if that's what you're trying to do. So you may need to dual tag in that situation, unfortunately.
Yeah, and that's a great question, Timothy. Thank you for that. And if anybody else has any burning questions, we encourage you to drop them in the chat. We want this to be valuable for you guys, if nothing else. But back onto this sort of chronology of the adoption curve. So we've got our basic GA config tag installed. So we're collecting some data, but kind of on Timothy's question. So how do you go from, my basic immediate need is satisfied to now I'm actually, using this close to its full capacity? Like, so in terms of rethinking a measurement structure, what would be advisable there? Should we sit down and say, hey, what are all the actions that I want to track on my site? Should we look at the list of standard events and map to them? I guess this happens on a spreadsheet first before GTM, but.
Good call. Yeah. So the answer is that you want to start planning before it's a measure twice, cut once type platform. You don't want to go in there and just start sending data in and then setting up all kinds of reports and then find out that you sent stuff through in a real quick fashion. A lot of this planning does exist inside a spreadsheet to some degree. What I've been doing with a lot of our clients where we're doing these transitions are we'll go into the existing universal analytics account and kind of do an audit of the event reports, because that's most of the stuff that you're going to have to be migrating over is stuff inside your UA event reports, because things like page views and stuff like that, that's going to be automatically handled by the GA4 tag that's being implemented on the site anyway. So you don't have to implement like everything custom. There's some stuff that Google will do automatically out of the box. It's that custom stuff that you've been doing, like tracking like on CTA clicks, like all that other like type of like micro interaction, if you will. You're going to want to take that and say like, okay, what data do we actually look at? Because we have it's a habit in the industry to kind of like focus on tracking everything under the sun and then hoping that like you cover all of it and then just in case you need it. But I think in most cases, we probably track way too much and then we just kind of go into analytics and we get analysis paralysis because there's just so much and we don't really know what to look at. So tracking like things like rich interactions is probably the best way I would describe, like the best way to approach this. Things like interacting with video, things that you can correlate highly to whatever you would consider a conversion, seeing whatever happens from that conversion and trying to look at the actions that people took prior to that conversion and drawing like, or looking at the trends for that and deciding like, oh, look, people that commonly watch a video also commonly turn into a lead, for instance. That's a very general way to like look at it, but looking at like the meaningful things that you want to track. And every single time I tell this to anybody, it's like start closest to the money and start your tracking audit from like, we need to track demo requests, like, because that's how people get entered into the bottom of our funnel, or like even stuff that's any part of the funnel entry, any type of lead, right? Or e-commerce transaction, obviously, is a very simple one to know that you need to track, right? So knowing what your conversion is and then working your way back and filling in as much detail as you can during that user or on-site journey so that you can answer questions inside your reports down the road. A lot of that just kind of takes a lot of like a deep dive look inside your analytics to see like how useful your current data is, because honestly, now's a better time, like a very good time to just kind of reinvestigate and just kind of start anew, because the data models are going to be entirely different. You're not going to be able to migrate your UA data into GA4 to have it all in one place, unfortunately. So you're going to have like a new data set that you're going to be looking at over a certain period of time. So it would be wise to kind of look at it from a fresh perspective and say like, okay, what do we actually want? What questions do we want to answer? And is the stuff that we're collecting now answering those questions? And then work your way from there, rather than just focusing on data. Collect as much data as possible, right? Because a lot of data doesn't necessarily mean useful data. Hopefully that answers your question, Chris, but it's a fairly complicated activity, but honestly, it's a nice activity too, because what ends up happening is that once everything gets into a spreadsheet and you start looking at like, okay, we want to track this thing as this event name and then send these data parameters through with it, you're naturally creating documentation for your tracking stack, which doesn't exist in 90% of organizations like universal analytics implementations, just because either so many agencies have been in the mix over time and they never adhered to a certain structure. WebMechanix, we have our own SOPs that we use for whenever we set up our tracking. So we have predictable patterns that we look for. So actually our migration from Universal to GA4 is actually quite easy because we kind of had a plan in place inside UA. So things are predictable to a degree, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's true for every single organization either. So it's just planning will get you really far, and it'll actually be good for your entire marketing team, and especially your data analysts, to know exactly what's being tracked and why and how. That way there's like kind of like a living, breathing document of all that stuff as well.
Derek, we got a great question in from Christian. He says, we haven't done too much research into GA4 changes yet. Do UTM tags exist and get tracked in GA4, or is that being retired with UA going away?
No, UTMs will still work. They actually introduced 3 new UTMs too. I can't remember the names of them off the top of my head, but the UTMs that you know and love and use all over your tagging and like your ad campaigns or email campaigns, all that stuff is parsed by Google Analytics. Some differences do exist with how Google parses them in the context of what they consider a session in GA4 versus a session inside Universal Analytics, because data is just treated differently there, but it does track that information through. So that isn't something that you need to worry about, so to speak. The only downside to the UTMs that I've seen so far on GA4 is that if you use a lot of custom source medium combinations that don't adhere to the default channel reporting that Google uses inside Universal Analytics, GA4 right now does not have a custom channel groupings feature. It sounds like it's coming down the road from a lot of like the chatter in the community. Nothing's been set in stone, but right now that's been a kind of a challenge for some organizations that do a lot of custom non-standard UTM tagging for like source medium especially. inside their reports. So that may be one thing, but hopefully that's coming soon. But it shouldn't stop you from adopting now and early to do that.
Yeah. Thanks, Derek. Great question from Amanda. If you're about to go through a website redesign, is it still pertinent to capture the old data for any purpose?
The old data, so capturing the old data, could you expand on that? So just so I understand what you mean there. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah,
I think in general, the old data is can be useful. Oh, so she means
what your website currently
the
has.
website, what the website currently has. So I think the concept is you'll never be able to transport the historic data, one-to-one from your old platform to the new one. It's still useful to have and to study and digest up until Jan 1, 2024, when it officially goes away, because like any insights that can be drawn or anything useful that you can pull from that data is still useful and still valid. But in terms of the things that were being tracked, if you were tracking valuable behaviors, you should track them again, just in GA4.
Right. Yeah. And I think the question maybe too is like, if you're actively undergoing a redesign, should you worry about tagging your existing non-redesigned website that's going to be replaced soon with GA4? If it were up to me and if I knew the time frame was within the next few months, I would just say do the GA4 stuff on your new website and not worry about it, because there's not like, you don't want to double your work up, and you could spend that mental that I'll have all that mental like space for just actually like paying attention to GA4 stuff on the new website side of things. But it really depends on what the timelines are, if that's the case as well.
Yep. And so I want to get in, Derek, to some of the cool features, some of the reasons that Google is doing this. There's another question from Timothy. I don't think WebMechanix offers this, but maybe consulting for the transition. Absolutely, Timothy. We're happy to do that. And we do offer that as a service. So feel free to hit us up after this. But one major thing that becomes evident immediately when you log in for the first time to GA4 is like, my reports. Where are my reports? And I remember when we first saw GA4, quite frankly, we were like, what the heck? Like, why is Google doing this? This is so much less useful on the surface. Can we still get the old reports that we used to love?
For the most part, yes. It does take a little bit of like gymnastics to figure out how to do it at first. We have two very brilliant people in-house that are handling the reporting rebuilding side for very common UA reports that you may know and love, like landing page reports and stuff like that. Honestly, my expertise is more on the implementation and like understanding like the data models and the API side of things from the tracking perspective. We have much more capable people in-house that aren't on this call today, unfortunately, that handle the reporting side. So there may actually be another growth clinic thing in the future about like GA4 reporting, like at some point, right, Chris? So I think that having somebody there at some point would be good to talk about that. But yes, it's entirely possible to get most of your reports back. There are some just general limitations, and I don't want to talk too much about the bad about the platform. I would like to get into some of the positive stuff here and like some of the new cool stuff, right? But there is some like minor limitations or just some limitations based off of like Google is still actively working on this. They say that GA4 is out of a beta phase, but there are things that are just like blatantly like short. Like it just seems like they're just missing, like things like not having a conversion rate metric inside most reports. You're like, huh? Like that seems important. Like you kind of want that. There are signs that that's coming up. It's just I think that they took the beta label off of it to not scare people from trying to implement it, right? So they took the beta label off of it, but like really, whenever you think about it, there's still very many things about it that is rough around the edges, but it is evolving over time. They are doing a good job. It's a big job, so you have to kind of be grateful that they're actually still doing this because it is free. Well, free, you're giving them data to some degree, but it is a free product just like UA. So there's good to there too. But yeah, you can do it. There's nothing that you're gonna, there's very little that you're gonna lose in terms of like UA, what you can't do. It's just how you do it.
Yep. Okay, cool. So you can have your old reports back. You just got to build them once, it sounds like, and then you can reference.
Yeah, and then good thing about all the reporting in GA4, which is something that's completely different from, say, something like Universal Analytics, is once you get the data flowing in there, you can go and you can build a report from that old data that's in there, and it will just build the report based off the data that's in there. UA was more of a like, you have to set the report up and hope that it's all set up, and then nothing was retroactive. A lot of the stuff inside GA4 is retroactive. So like if you made a mistake, you're not like sitting there going, oh, I wish I would have had the foresight to do it. Like as long as your data collection is accurate, like you're actually collecting the right things and paying attention to the right things, a lot of your reports are retroactive. So it's not like you're stuck, you know, which is really a great thing. That's why part of the flexibility is really nice.
Oh, that's great. So yeah, so if you launch a campaign without fully thinking through the tracking, you can probably still generate some reports retroactively.
Yeah, so like that's a good jumping point to like some of like the new like advantages and like features that it has, right? So like one of the best things about the tool is there's a new area called the Explore reports, which is kind of, if you're familiar with like using Google Data Studio at all, it's kind of like a Google Data Studio type like report builder, where there are pre-built templates that you can like download from the gallery if you wanted to do something like create a trended funnel report or just a funnel report in general, or you can just start from scratch and just have like a blank canvas and just start creating these reports. And it's very powerful because again, the nice thing about GA4 is that everything is an event. So, and before inside Universal Analytics, if you ever wanted to do like a conversion funnel to see like attrition rate per step, like a multi-step form or something like that, the only way you could do that was by faking page views inside of Universal Analytics and then doing the step-by-step funnel attrition, which required a lot of weird development and tagging type stuff to make that work. And it was just kind of broken because it was all based off page views, which is a really weird way to kind of measure anything on the web now, because not everything involves page views. Pages are highly dynamic. They change based off user interaction, right? You can create any type of funnel report you want based off of any event and its parameters inside like a whatever. And you can create as many steps as you want. And this again is all retroactive. So you can create as many of these reports as you want. It doesn't have to be tied to a conversion. It can be done to be completely just as an analysis. Actually, like funnel-based goals aren't really a thing anymore. What it instead it is, it's just a report that you build any type of funnel, which if you're into any type of like paid advertising, conversion rate optimization, that should sound like music to your ears, right? Because having to do that based off page views was probably the most painful thing about Universal Analytics in the universe, especially from the implementation side, because sending like junk data into UA just to track a funnel didn't make sense from a data perspective. So like there's a lot of cool reports like that inside that Explore report capability or the exploration gallery. And like I said earlier, a lot of those reports are based on or very focused on the concept of looking at specific users or just users in general. So there's like a new user explorer report where let's say you're sending through somebody's Google Analytics client ID into your CRM whenever you capture them as a lead, and you wanted to see exactly what that person did on the website, you could take that ID and then plug it into the user explorer report, and it'll show you all of their sessions and what they did, as long as they still had that ID, which was impossible to do inside UA for the most part too. So like there's some really cool stuff in there that's going to make analysis entirely different ballgame compared to where we were with UA, right? So that's like the reporting side of things. There's a ton of stuff you can do in there, and we could talk about it. And honestly, our two people over here, I see we have a question from Jim. So do you want to say what that is, Jared?
Yeah, what was the name of that user tracking ID?
It's a client ID. So the Google Analytics will drop a first-party cookie to distinguish a user or a visitor, right? That's how Google can determine like repeat versus like new users. So they drop a client ID, and that cookie is usually like named _GA or _GA and then some characters on it. It's like it'll start with GA and then a bunch of numbers on it. That's just a way that Google can kind of differentiate user A versus user B in an anonymous fashion, because again, no one's logged in most website type like applications. So that's kind of the way that they distinguish users. So in the real world, like a user is really a browser until somebody logs in and identifies themselves with a custom ID, which you can definitely do, but we don't want to get too far down that road today. So that's what it is. It's the Google Analytics client ID.
So really quickly, there's been a couple of references to a follow-up event where we talk about some more detailed reporting items. Just by like a quick chat, would anybody here be interested in that follow-up session? Like if we pull an analyst to actually like go through, like share a screen and show the GA4 interface with some cool reporting things that you could do? Cool. All right, we got some interest.
Sure, and yes, and
Yep.
totally.
Yep.
Yes.
And continuing on some of the cool stuff, this one is probably my favorite one, and it probably is going to sound really cool to a lot of people here. In Universal Analytics, there was no way under the free Universal Analytics plan, unless you paid for the GA360 platform, which was like $150,000 a year, which is way more than most people want to spend on some type of tool in any type of like small to mid market, right? You could not export that data to something to warehouse it and own it yourself in something like BigQuery if you wanted to have that like data and then have your own internal analysts like use that data or connect it to another tool for visualization or something like that. GA4 now has a native BigQuery export for you to be able to warehouse your data inside BigQuery's inside Google's BigQuery platform, which is incredibly important and incredibly awesome that they're doing this, because you don't have to pay that $150K price tag to use it anymore. You can just go in there on any GA4 account that's made, and you can set up a BigQuery export to a project inside BigQuery. And the costs for just warehousing and storing your data are minor. Like there is some costs with the storage and stuff like that. But for example, last month for WebMechanix, we don't have a ton of traffic on our site, but just for an example, we spent 8 cents on data storage for BigQuery. So it's not like you're gonna break the bank. Even for large organizations that are capturing lots of data, you're gonna not spend a ton of money. And I highly advise like storing and archiving that data, because you wanna own that data. You've been collecting it. And it's there, and especially because there's going to be a max data retention limit of like 14 months inside GA4 for like any of your advanced reporting needs. If you need to pull any like historic reports for like a year over year analysis, you're going to have to use something like BigQuery to connect to a data source to do that, because there's not going to be the ability to permanently just access that data inside the the GA4 UI to do that. So it's something that every organization should do, even if you're like a plumber. Like you should do it. Like 8 cents isn't going to break the bank. You want to own that data. There's a billion reasons why that I don't want to get into, but it's super easy to set up. It takes all of like 10 minutes once you create like a Google Cloud account, stuff like that. And that's a really cool feature that was only available to like the richest of the companies that could afford $150K a year on an analytics software, right? So that's a huge thing. So there are two other things that I kind of want to mention here. Audiences, like audience creation inside GA4 for the purpose of like remarketing and things like that. If you do a lot of like Google ads or Google remarketing type stuff, audiences inside GA4 are crazy cool, because they are not just like simple like buckets that you put people into. You can actually do something that are called like sequenced events. So if you wanted to create like an audience based off of somebody doing a sequence of things on a website, like say landed on web page, watched 50% of video, then viewed a form, you could put that group of people into an audience, which is really cool, because now you're looking at very small slices of very hyper like relevant or intentful people that may not have converted. So like audiences are completely changed. And I actually haven't dipped my toes into playing with that all that much, but I know it's possible. I know that our internal like paid advertising team would probably be salivating at this stuff right now, and we're actually getting it into their hands very soon here. So like that's some really cool stuff that you can do as well. And the other last thing that I kind of wanted to mention inside like the major like benefits to getting this set up is GA4 also opens up the window for you to start talking about maybe offloading some of your tracking that runs inside the client side or the browser, like say something like the client side Google Tag Manager container that you run. GA4 is a means to kind of get set up on server-side tagging via a server-side tag manager environment, which opens up a whole new world of possibilities for other things too. Because once you start getting into a different environment that doesn't involve like working inside a user's browser, you can start doing some really cool stuff. And there's some highly technical topics there that you can get into, but it makes the adoption of such a thing so much easier, because GA4 was kind of built to work with like the server-side tagging in conjunction. So getting set up on GA4 is actually going to proof or get you prepared for if and when you want to do that down the road, which is really neat. I just said a mouthful of things, so I will shut up for a second.
Oh, that's awesome. I'm curious, are there any, so as we're getting this set up and as we're setting up our instance, are there any things we should watch out for or mistakes we should avoid?
I think I touched on a couple of them earlier. Avoid the temptation to do it as fast as humanly possible, in the cheapest way possible. I know that costs are always a factor in anything that you do, but you get what you pay for. There's a lot of people right now that are going out there and saying like, oh, use this service that's $40 to automatically migrate your UA events to GA4. I promise you that that will not be as useful as somebody going in and actually looking at it from a perspective of the actual business and what needs to be captured and what questions you're trying to answer. Because just because the data is being collected inside UA doesn't necessarily mean it's being collected in a efficient way or that things are being collected accurately too. So that would be my biggest blanket statement, is like, be aware of that. We are happy to like answer questions. If somebody's coming at you with like a GA4 or a UA to GA4 transition plan and they're not providing you any documentation, that should be a red flag. It's a fairly complicated thing. So you don't want to have somebody that's like, yeah, we'll handle that for you for $100, because you will eventually feel some pain, unless that person's the greatest and most kind person and then builds you documentation for $100 and does all that. But you'll see what happens. But I don't know. So that's like one thing I would say.
Yeah, and you guys, to Timothy's point, we're here for you. If you need help, feel free to reach out to us. We can provide some very reasonable, if not free advice, like some reasonable pricing for just getting the basic code set up if you need help with that. We've also got a boilerplate container that we use to make the full migration process much easier. So we got you. You're part of our community here. We want to take good care of you. So feel free to just reach out to Jarrett or respond to any of the emails that we're sending, and we'll be in touch with you right away.
Yep, and I can highlight the other like limitations or current drawbacks. I don't like using the word drawbacks because I think they're more limitations than drawbacks right now. I expect the tool to keep getting better over time. Again, I feel like it's still in this weird beta, not a beta phase, which should hopefully by the time next July rolls around feel less like that. They've been adding new things on a seemingly weekly basis or fixing things. So I do have hopes there. But the main thing is that I mentioned earlier, the learning curve is kind of steep compared to Universal Analytics. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad tool. It just means it's something completely different. So it's going to feel a little bit more overwhelming compared to Universal Analytics, where you could kind of hop in and then click something and then see a report. That's going to be probably the most challenging thing for most people that aren't used to going in there and like knowing like what the data model is and stuff like that. The interface right now is a little bit slow and buggy in places because they're constantly updating the software. So like that's kind of like part of the part where I'm saying like, okay, it's kind of in a beta because they're kind of using like updating it as is, or at like on an ongoing fashion, like an iterative process, right? So that's kind of bad, but it's getting better. Like people are submitting the bug reports to GA and they're taking their time to knock it out, but they're getting it done. The biggest thing that I think I've run into that kind of drives me a little bit crazy is that, not crazy, it's kind of just a pain at the moment, is that the data processing delays between Universal Analytics and GA4. Universal Analytics, you could probably refresh your data a few times a day and you get pretty accurate results for the current state of the day if you were looking at like a current, like the same day reporting type thing. GA4 can have up to a 72-hour reporting processing time or a data processing time if it's being really slow, which makes like same day and prior day reporting kind of a pain in places. So if you do a lot of that, that might be a current pain point. Hopefully that stuff gets faster as well. BigQuery can help you with that some like warehousing that stuff in BigQuery and streaming that to like a daily, there's like a daily export option or like a streaming export option will give you better real-time data. It does require a little bit more setup. So like that's kind of like a pain. And the e-commerce related features inside GA4 are a little bit lacking compared to the enhanced e-commerce stuff inside of Universal Analytics right now. I don't do a ton of e-commerce tracking. I've done enough of it to know how to set it up, but it just doesn't seem like there's the granularity that you're able to set up or see the reports that you could inside UA. We do expect that to improve over time. I think that Google just kind of knocked out the most important stuff, like being able to see like transactions and stuff like that. But a lot of that, I think, is also due to the fact that because GA4 is that kind of that very flexible model, they are providing you those things like the Explore reports enabled and telling you to be able to go in there and just build out whatever you want to see too. So it's kind of like that. It's like you accept the new data model and the work that Google did to make it as flexible as possible. But on the other hand, like Google's like, okay, now you're kind of responsible for building the reports out that you want to see. And then the last thing that I have on my list here, this probably doesn't handle or hit most people unless you're collecting lots of data. There's this concept of cardinality inside Universal Analytics, and cardinality is the total number of unique values for a particular dimension. So let's say like page URL, for instance, or page inside Universal Analytics. You would run into issues with cardinality inside Universal Analytics whenever you had a lot of data, like 50,000 plus rows of data inside a report. And then one of your dimensions inside that report had a high cardinality value to it. So something like page URL is a really common one because there's lots of different page URLs, and anything that has like Google Analytics click ID or like Facebook click IDs, those are always going to be unique. So that creates like a lot of unique values. What this ended up creating was just rows inside your GA or your Universal Analytics report that just said other, and they wouldn't really tell you like what that data was because it was kind of like aggregated into just one row because there's just like this high cardinality dimension. GA4 handles cardinality in an arguably worse way, and it seems to come up more frequently. So we've noticed that other shows up in reports more frequently, and it's something that the community's been talking about. We're hopeful that it's getting sorted out before next July. Again, I don't know if that's true. Again, it also really depends on how much data you're collecting and what kind of reports you're pulling as well. You shouldn't run into it inside of any of your Explore reports that I was mentioning, where you kind of have that drag and drop like report builder type thing. But any of your standard reports inside GA4 that you go and use, that's where you run into like the cardinality more so than anything. But that's a very specific thing, and I'm happy to expand on that if anybody has questions, but that's just a known issue that we're running into at the moment.
Cool. So takeaway, if nothing else, is get the basic tag set up. Now, Derek, it's okay to run both at the same time, right?
Yeah, you won't have any issues there.
Yeah, so you can run both at the same time, and then at least you'll be starting to collect some data. Also start thinking through your website, either your current website or the website that you're planning, and think about what elements are most important to track, and just get them all down on a spreadsheet. Because I think if you approach, either your internal analytics and BI team, or if you are working with an agency, it's useful to have just some kind of starting point of like, here are some things that we feel are important to track. And I think from what I've been seeing out in the market, that would put you like at least on par. Like you wouldn't be at that point behind the 8-ball, and you'll have some data you can get in. You can start familiarizing yourself with the interface. Google has a lot of good support documentation and things that you could use. And then I guess from there, as the date gets closer and closer, you're going to want to start building out some of those custom tracking. Derek, in your perspective, is it important to kind of configure tracking for everything that's important all at once, or can this be done kind of like in a phased or in an ongoing way?
I mean, it could definitely be phased because your tracking implementation is never done, right? Like there's always something that you find out by analyzing the data, and then you say, oh, well, it would be really interesting if we knew this other thing, right? So it's never like your tracking or your data implementation should never be to like set it and forget it. Some organizations that may work well for, some others are going to be more data driven. It really depends on how data driven your organization is. So like I would just say that blanket statement is that it should never be just considered done and then dust your hands off and walk away from it, right? But I will say that it is more important to capture the most like mission critical things for your business, like anything that you need to do to know if a campaign is being effective or not. So conversions being the number one thing, tracking events that are explicitly named and actionable in nature. to know like when people are going to your website and taking the actions required to enter your sales funnel, especially. So generating leads, for example, is like our biggest thing because we work in mostly a B2B context, but we have some B2C customers as well. So things like demo requests, white paper downloads, ebook downloads, that kind of stuff, having those be explicitly named and actionable events that you can look at inside of reports and then toggle those events on as conversions inside of GA4 is going to do you more good, or yeah, more good, I guess is fine. It's going to do you more good than going in and trying to worry about tracking clicks on every single little thing and little element on your pages, because you want to start, like I said earlier, closest to the money as you can, and then work your way backward and fill in all those little micro interactions, because it's easy to get analysis paralysis and set up too much and just worry about collecting everything, because you'll never get to a point where you track everything and you'll never have to touch it again, because your website's going to change over time. Your KPIs may change over time. You may introduce a brand new thing that's not currently being tracked, like a new offer or a new product or something like that you need to kind of measure. So it's just important to think about it in that fashion. It's not like a set in stone thing and you just forget about it.
All right, very
Thanks, Tim.
good. Yeah, thank you, Tim, and we'll definitely be in touch. And if anybody else has any other questions, you can feel free to reach out to Jared anytime. We'll do our best to respond. We'll definitely get a session for some GA4 reporting tips and techniques on the docket here soon. If not next week, then one of the weeks to come. So we hope that you'll join us for that as well, and we'll do some screen sharing and actually show the interface and show you some interesting things that you could do. As always, if you've got any other topics that you'd like to hear about,
Yep.
we're all ears there. And if you need any specific help, then just let us know. We're here for
I'm
you.
happy to answer any other questions that anybody may have if they didn't get their questions into. I don't want to chop off. I know that we usually add time for more Q&A at the end. There's a lot of different things to cover here because it's a huge topic. So I'm fine with going over a little bit if anybody has questions by any means.
Yep.
Go ahead.
Just a quick heads up. So next week's Growth Clinic is going to be all about conversion rate optimization. So we're going to be talking CRO opportunities for 2022. So feel free to join us for that and get your CRO game on. And as Chris was saying, we'll be doing GA4 reporting here in the near future because clearly there's a lot of demand for it. So stay tuned for that.
Yeah, and then it sounds like Derek's got a few more minutes. So if anybody has any other burning questions, I can stay a few minutes after the hour too, but I know that it's, yep. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you.
All right, so I see a lot of people dropping off. I imagine we've got 1 p.m. appointments.
Right, yeah, that's probably what it is.
Yeah.
Completely understandable.
Yeah, and it's lunchtime for me. So I'm probably going to jump as well.
Good stuff.
But thank you very much, Derek. That was an amazing session. Yep.
I'm happy to do another one too if we want to talk more nitty-gritty type stuff too. So it's fun.
Sure.
Awesome.
All right.
Cool.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Have a
Be in
great
touch.
Wednesday
Bye.
and a great week. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.